As funding cuts were being made and surplus equipment was being taken out of service in the years immediately following the Second World War, each branch of the United States military was trying to prove its value. Against this backdrop, several technologies that had emerged during the recently ended conflict began to reshape military strategy and force planners to reconsider the traditional approaches to warfare. One of the most significant of these was the guided rocket or missile, which promised to strike targets with unprecedented speed, range, and accuracy. With the Army already in the process of developing land-based rockets based on the German V-2, the Navy wanted to demonstrate that it too could harness the same power. Operation Sandy was its opportunity to show just that. In early 1947, meetings were held between naval officials and ordnance personnel from the White Sands Proving Grounds to determine the feasibility and logistics of launching a captured German V-2 rocket from a moving aircraft carrier. After determining that it would indeed be feasible, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Chief of Naval Operations, gave the operation his blessing. On May 22, 1947, Operation Sandy was officially established with Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery, who was an early advocate of the project, assigned to oversee it. If that name seems familiar, yes, he is the same man who oversaw the capture of U-505 in the Eastern Atlantic in June of 1944. USS Midway, the U.S. Navy's newest and largest carrier at the time, was selected as the test ship. While early U.S. military rockets had been somewhat successful during the war, they were extremely small and had very limited capabilities when compared to the German V-2 rocket. Developed during the 1930s and early 1940s, it was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, and by war's end, almost 3,100 V-2s had been launched at targets inside England, France, and Belgium. Following the end of hostilities in May of 1945, components of captured rockets along with many of the scientists that had developed the V-2, including the infamous Wernher von Braun, were brought to the United States to accelerate the country's fledgling missile program. The first test launch of a V-2 was conducted at the White Sands Missile Range on April 16, 1946. Over the course of the next year, nearly 30 more V-2s were test-fired. Within a few weeks of the establishment of Operation Sandy, a group of officers and enlisted men from Midway traveled out to White Sands, where they underwent intensive training in the preparation, handling, and launching of the rockets. Once this was completed, the U.S. Army provided the Navy with 2 live rockets for the test launch and a dummy for training purposes. These were subsequently moved by rail from White Sands to the Norfolk Navy Yard, where Midway was birthed, during late August of 1947. The carrier was tied up adjacent to the railroad tracks that ran through the yard, as well as the cranes that were needed to get the V-2s up and onto her flight deck. Over the final days of August, a special steel launch platform, which was designed to withstand the enormous thrust of the V-2, was erected on her aft flight deck. But this was not the only concern for Midway's crew. Once in place, the rocket had to be stabilized appropriately since the carrier would be underway while it was on the launch pad. Fumes and fire from the rocket's ignition had to be directed safely away from it, and communications and tracking systems had to be developed for use at sea. On September 2nd, with all of her preparations finalized, Midway, along with her escort of 4 destroyers, got underway for the launch area, which was approximately 250 miles south of Bermuda. At 3:53 p.m. on September 6, 1947, the V-2 rocket was ignited as Midway's crew, civilian observers, and the Navy's top brass looked on. The rocket's exhaust rattled the flight deck and sent up a towering plume of smoke. 2 seconds after liftoff, the V-2 unexpectedly tilted about 45 degrees to starboard and headed in the direction of Midway's superstructure. Neil Casey, one of Midway's fire controlmen, was part of the tracking team assigned to follow the V-2 once it left the carrier's deck. His specific assignment that day was to call its range down to the plotting room. Positioned on the carrier's island near her bridge, Casey estimated that the rocket missed the superstructure by a mere 100 yards. Within a few seconds, though, the V-2 returned to a vertical track and, to the great relief of all aboard the new American flat top, began to head for the heavens. However, as the rocket reached an altitude of about 12,000 feet, its flight path became erratic, and control was lost. It soon broke into 3 parts and fell into the Atlantic Ocean a little more than 3 miles from Midway. Despite the failure to achieve a complete flight, the launch itself proved that carriers could withstand the stress of a rocket blast and that shipboard launches were feasible, which satisfied the major objectives of the test. In his after-action report, Rear Admiral Gallery declared that Operation Sandy demonstrated the practicability of launching the war-proven German V-2 missile from a modern aircraft carrier without interfering with the primary purpose of that vessel, and that the operation, quote, marked the beginning of a new era in naval weapons. The Navy followed up with Operation Pushover in 1949, a controlled test where a fully fueled V-2 was deliberately toppled over on a simulated carrier deck at the White Sands range to study what kind of damage an accident might cause. The combined results of these tests helped to shape the Navy's understanding of the risks, requirements, and potential of deploying missiles at sea. Although Operation Sandy did not directly lead to V-2 deployments on U.S. warships, it did bring clarity and guided the Navy's subsequent missile programs. In the broader sweep of early Cold War experimentation, Operation Sandy was a bold and highly visible step that demonstrated the Navy's determination to remain a central player in the national security of the United States. Thank you for watching. If you're a fan of my channel, please think about subscribing and possibly even becoming a channel member. Some of the perks that come with it are early access to my videos and members-only shorts, but please don't feel pressured or anything. Once again, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.